combination. I'm originally a chemical engineer. I started work in the pharmaceutical industry, and through various, I guess, risk taking, I went through consulting into insurance, and I find myself at Argo Group. I guess what I'm going to tell you is how I'd go about setting an ESG strategy now. I can't guarantee that's how I went about it because I kind of learned on the journey, but hopefully I can give you a few pointers. Yeah, by all means, fire questions in, but essentially, I think we need to start off with what is ESG. And yes, it's a three-letter acronym, and I would argue it's a risk, but it's also an opportunity, depending on how your organization wants to position it. It's definitely becoming a board level issue. Lots of stakeholders are targeting directors directly. And it's, I would argue, something you need to get involved with. I don't think it's going away. And the other thing I'd say is it's not just about climate risk. So just to look into ESG a little bit further, unfortunately, there's no single standard that defines ESG. There are quite a few. I'll talk about standards and reporting a little bit later, but there is some hope, is all I would say in terms of standardization. The environment piece is fairly obvious in terms of climate and carbon footprint, but there are other impacts on biodiversity. There are things to do with water usage, energy, waste that are not just about directly climate. Social has grown in importance quite a lot, especially through COVID. It's quite a broad category, and it obviously covers employee well-being and diversity and inclusion, but more and more it's where other things get put, and depending on your stakeholder, they may even put things like data privacy and information security there because it's the information that about your clients. It definitely covers recruitment, staff retention, training and development, but also your vendors and your supply chain, and increasingly things like human rights and labor standards in those supply chains. Governance is pretty well understood from a corporate governance point of view and a business ethics perspective, but there are quite a few kind of competitiveness, tax issues that, and really doing the right thing kind of elements that keep expanding into that area. The latest area that is quite topical is executive remuneration, and the potential link of ESG into that is how does ESG get factored into those schemes, which is a question that's increasingly being asked. So why is ESG so important? Why is it called ESG? Most organizations call it sustainability. It's the investment community that's calling it ESG, and it's because those are the factors that the investment community have been evaluating and scoring over time. And in an ideal world, the investment community would have ESG down to numbers, and this would be an automated process because they're looking for trackers and to be able to do some quant work around this. And so that's where the pressure's coming from. There's an increasing demand for ESG funds, and there's probably not enough ESG funds to go around, which is why this kind of market segment's quite warm. And there's an increasing danger of what's called greenwashing, which is that you promise a lot, and when you scratch the surface, there's not a huge amount happening. So in terms of setting a strategy, my argument would be most people start with, gee, I've got to report something. Now, what did I do? And that, I would say that's back to front. And I'm going to take you through a 4-step process. It's really simple. That doesn't mean it's easy to do, but it's really simple. So there are 4 steps: context, strategy, program, and monitoring. So I'll take you through them each one at a time. But just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, context is really about your stakeholders, what they expect of you, and the threats and opportunities that you face. strategy is really about putting it into the context of your business strategy and what is your ambition in terms of ESG. Program is what are you going to get done, who's going to do it, and by when. And monitoring is did it happen, key performance indicators, and where some people start external reporting. So I'm going to unpick that a little bit. So in terms of context, it's all about trying to understand where you sit. So understanding your stakeholder expectations. Who are your stakeholders? How much influence do they have? How much interest do they have? You can do that. You can capture that in a stakeholder map. You can capture that by looking at a materiality grid, which is what's important to your organization, what's important to your stakeholders, and things that are high are probably the priorities. I guess there's a hidden message there, which is somehow you've got to find out, one, who your stakeholders are, and two, what is important to them. And this is pretty important to ESG. Rather than starting with a checklist, you need to kind of think, well, who are my stakeholders? If I'm a private company, I'm going to have a completely different set of stakeholders to if I'm a public company. If I'm operating in insurance, it's going to be a different stakeholder group to banking, to manufacturing. So that actually tilts the equation. I think the second thing is trying to understand who your peers are and where they are up to, because inevitably many stakeholders, particularly investors, regulators, rating agencies, are going to compare you to your peers. So you don't want to be the people at the back of the queue in terms of performance. So you can do that by benchmarking. You can do that using maturity models. You can do gap analyses against best practice, but you need a sense of where you sit in the world. And actually, there's some tools I'll talk about later that can help you with that. Then you need to understand the threats and opportunities that you face. So this is really applying risk management to ESG. Now, I'm a risk manager originally, so I would say that, but I think it's a pretty good approach because, it's a case of there's some things that could go wrong that you need to think about trying to control, and then there's maybe some places where you can get competitive advantage out of this. Why are we all doing this? Because you have to prioritize. You can't do everything. Trust me, the list of things under ESG is too long to get done. So you need to kind of work out where you want to sit to find what your ambition is. Do you want to be a leader on this? Do you want to be in the pack? Are you quite happy to sit at the back? So how much effort are you prepared to put into this? And actually a pretty good example is if you look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 of them, and they cover pretty much the entire scope of ESG. And most organizations would struggle to tackle 17 priorities. We actually have chosen 3 at Argo, and that's already a stretch. So I think my point here is figure out what you want to achieve, target that, and don't be scared to upset or disappoint one of your stakeholders, because you're not going to keep everybody happy. In terms of the strategy, well, you need to kind of think about 3 or 4 things. So culture, governance, operating model, and resources. So what kind of organization are you? What's the culture like? The ESG program needs to fit with the culture, and it needs to kind of represent the values of the organization. The governance, so who does what? What's the role of the board? What's the role of management? What kind of committees do you need? What kind of reporting do you need? The operating model, are you going to have a center of excellence on sustainability with a big team, or are you going to be more of a decentralized model, leveraging lots of resources across the organization in different teams, and then just having a very small sustainability team that kind of pulls it all together? And then resourcing, well, there aren't that many sustainability specialists out there. It's a little bit like Solvency II. Anybody with 6 months experience is an expert, but that doesn't necessarily get you to where you want to be. So word of warning. Yeah, just thinking about the ESG program itself, what are you going to try and do? And this is really all about change management. It's nothing clever. It's change management. It's project management, scope and timelines, accountabilities, and lots of communication. Certainly in an insurance company or actually in a bank, the core thing is your underwriting, either your insurance underwriting or your lending. What does that portfolio look like? Who are you choosing to provide products to? And do you have targeted solutions that are actually socially responsible or green? So that's the toughest bit, but the most rewarding. You've obviously got your own operations, so your offices have a greenhouse gas footprint. Your business travel, your data centers are a particularly large item because they're pumping out a lot of energy, and then your vendors, the people you choose to do business with. So that's your operational footprint. And finally, your investments. So most insurance companies, most banks have got a balance sheet. What is it invested in? Is it responsibly invested? And what's the carbon intensity of that portfolio? So you'll see a lot of pressure out there to adopt net zero, both on the core business side, underwriting or banking, or on the investment side. But first, you need to understand what your baseline is. Obviously, timelines in terms of how quickly you want to move, which is really a factor of where you want to be and what your stakeholders' expectations are. And then there's a lot of communication and education required because this is a whole new language for a lot of people. Finally, monitoring. So you've got a board, you've got a steering committee, you've got a program. How's it going? Who needs to know what? How do you know if you're doing well? What are your key performance indicators, and who's responsible for them? So that's just part of the change management. And then back to where many people start, external reporting. So what does your website say? What do you need? What do your clients expect you to disclose? What are the international standards out there, which I'll get into in a minute. So just thinking about this, when I started doing this, I discovered that we were already being rated by organizations called ESG rating agencies. These are not credit rating agencies, they are ESG rating agencies, some of whom you'll have heard of because they also are credit rating agencies like Moody's or S&P, but some are specialists like MSCI or Sustainalytics. So the first thing is to find out who's rating you and what they say about you. And that can be a shock because basically many of them only work from information in the public domain. So if you don't say anything, then your score's not going to be very good. And as I explained to my board, using just a silly example, if you don't have a human rights policy, they'll assume that you don't care, and you'll get the same score as an organization that murders children. So think about whether you want a human rights policy. So that's a little bit the landscape, is understanding what these people say about you. As I said at the beginning, there isn't a common understanding of ESG. Each of them looks at it differently, and there is a pretty low correlation between being good on one and good on the other. In terms of reporting standards, there's quite a lot of change happening at the moment. Historically, there were half a dozen big reporting standards. Probably the two best known are TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. These are all merging together. The IFRS Foundation announced at the COP26 environmental conference that they were launching an international sustainability standards board, and SASB and TCFD are being brought together, but we haven't got any of the details yet. And I think the other major thing for anybody that's listed in New York is the SEC is overdue to put out guidance on what their expectations are. So I would say the answer to which way is this going is more reporting, more verification, more external challenge, and more, I guess, more stakeholder interest. So yeah, I think in essence, that's what I really wanted to lay out at the beginning, is you need to kind of figure out why is it important to you? Where do you want to be? And that will tell you your operating model in terms of, are you centralized, decentralized, how much resource do you need? What are you going to target? If I just read out the 3 UN Sustainability Development Goals that we picked number 13, which is climate action, not surprisingly, as an insurer. We picked out sustainability cities and communities because that's something we think we can make a difference around in terms of being a property casualty insurer. And we picked out gender equality because it fits with our diversity and inclusion program. So, but there are plenty of other things there, some of which are maybe more relevant to Bermuda, like life below the water, that kind of thing. But yeah, I think it's pick your fights and try and get something tangible done rather than promise too much and spread yourself too thin. Okay, so I don't know how we're doing on the question front.
Yeah, we've got a couple. One in the chat is, you kind of touched on this, but I'm sure in your role you're well prepared to talk about it more, is ERM, the Enterprise Risk Management Program, a subset of ESG or vice versa, or are they equals? How do they interact?
Yeah, I don't think they're a subset of either of them. I think they complement each other, because I think ESG is really about your long-term strategy and what you stand for as a company, an organization, and trying to translate that into something tangible that you can point your finger at. So lots of companies right now are looking at diversity and inclusion and well-being. It's from an enterprise risk management point of view, it's a threat and an opportunity. If you don't do something in that area, you're going to get hit problems. You're going to have unhappy staff. You're going to have employment disputes. But if you do it particularly well, it's competitive advantage in terms of hiring and retaining staff. So I think, to me, ERM is just a lens through which you can kind of look at all the ESG issues and prioritize them. And if you look at it the other way, ESG is just a risk category. And actually, in our risk framework, we have now pulled out climate as a risk category at the same level as financial or operational risk. That's partly as a reaction to quite a lot of regulatory scrutiny coming in the UK and New York State, and increasingly, as we're seeing from the insurance code of conduct being reviewed in Bermuda, it's coming to a place near you.
What should kind of everyday staff be thinking about, or how should they be reacting if they don't feel that management or the board is reacting enough to ESG pressures?
Yeah, well, I think there are opportunities to raise the questions. I mean, we have town halls in our company. We have quite a few questions related to this, which is good. We have quite an active diversity and inclusion committee and employee resource groups, so people can get involved in that and try and channel their energy. We have a sustainability working group, which is kind of for the broader topic, and we've actually we're not turning any volunteers away. So because if people have got the energy to get involved, then that's really helpful. But yeah, I think the other area that most organizations have got some kind of innovation or a new ideas scheme, and we're finding that some of the ideas are related to energy conservation or doing things more efficiently, which means we use less resources. So if you've got an idea, find a channel. It may not be labeled ESG right now, but it could become so.
What do you think is the future for any companies that aren't getting on board? How sustainable are they, and how much what position they're gonna be in 5, 10 years? They haven't done enough.
Yeah, I think I'll kind of answer it in a couple of ways. I think in the insurance sector, it's getting harder and harder not to get involved. You may have seen in the press that AIG have recently announced that they're getting committed to climate targets. They were an organization that really didn't want to engage with this, and I think they've been forced by their shareholders. I think the combination of certainly in insurance, the combination of regulators, shareholders, and staff is quite powerful. So you can ignore one of those groups for a while, but to try and ignore all three is going to mean that you're going to struggle to hire and retain staff, which is pretty important. You're going to have regulatory troubles, and then the shareholders are going to kind of blackball you to some extent. So I think access to capital is going to become harder for companies that aren't at least trying. And I can start to see it from the other end of the telescope in terms of non-financial companies that are seeking insurance are going to find it harder to get insurance. So companies that dig coal out of the ground are struggling, but it will go broader than that. So it's going to get harder for organizations that burn coal for power and heat. It's going to get harder for companies that have significant, that use lots of natural resources, or that have scandals around staff, health and safety, and kind of ethics issues. So I think we're going to see the insurers and the banks struggle to provide products to these people, and it's going to be a little bit of pressure from both sides.
You kind of mentioned earlier about how the Bermuda Insurance Code of Conduct is incorporating sustainability risk more, and how other jurisdictions have, SASB, TCFD. What do you really see about the differences between Bermuda and other jurisdictions in these requirements?
Yeah, I think the BMA is still finding its way on this, and I know that they issued a qualitative survey in 2020 and a quantitative survey in 2021. And now they've got a number of aspects of sustainability risk management in the insurance code, which is out for consultation. Having read the document, it is a little bit confusing as to whether it's actually about sustainability or if it's just about climate, because the title says that sustainability and every point of detail is about climate. So I think they're still learning. Certainly in the UK, all the regulatory pressure is on climate, but there is increasingly pressure on diversity and inclusion at board level, and from a cultural point of view. And in the US, California and New York are probably the leading states in terms of their expectations. There are new regulations that come into force in August in New York State that affect anybody that has a footprint in that state. But I've been involved in regulatory reviews, routine ones, and financial examinations of other states in the US where the climate has been a question, even though they haven't got regulations, because they just see it as part of the risk profile and therefore they can ask about it. So I suspect that, to try and be more specific, in Bermuda, I think there's an expectation that this year's GSA or CISA will include content on climate and sustainability, and that would include the various elements. So some of the things we talked about, how is it governed at board level and management level? What's the effect on the risk appetite and risk framework? Maybe some stress and scenario tests, and maybe some description of any actions that are being taken.
I think we're seeing more and more that the climate change is affecting our insurance exposure data. So from an underwriter's perspective, how should they be thinking about ESG when making underwriting decisions? And is that different in different lines of business, property versus otherwise?
Yeah, I think this is the toughest area that we're still learning about. Are you still there? Because I think I may have some power issues. I just saw the lights dip.
I still can hear you. So
okay. I just warn you, if it all goes, then that's what's happening. Hopefully not. Yeah, definitely. I think at the end of the day, it's about risk selection and pricing, and each line of business will be different. So the factors you need to take into account for property are all about physical risk, fairly obviously. But if you look at professional lines, then the D&O exposures are all about litigation, and then you've got issues that are probably more across the board, which is about transition risk. So transition risk is the move from heavily fossil fuel energy sources to lower carbon ones, and that means that your clients may not be there. If you're an energy underwriter, then the oil and gas industry may not look the same way as it looks today. That being said, most oil and gas companies have got a clean energy division, and so it's really it's a journey rather than a sudden change. So I think that's some factors. The challenge I think most insurers have got right now, and certainly as we operate in Lloyd's, I can see it, is data. So there's going to be a demand for good quality ESG data to underwrite with, that says, okay, I've got to incorporate ESG into my risk selection pricing. What do I know about this organization's ESG performance, and where do I get that information? And is it part of the survey and kind of renewal questionnaires, or is it some kind of service provider that provides a database? And I suspect it's going to be a combination of both. But I think that's probably where we're heading, is for there to be some information. And I think what everybody's scratching their head around at the moment is, okay, if I had an ESG report on every insured when I was underwriting, what would I do with the report? And are the underwriters educated in this language? Would they know what to do with that piece of information? And is the information tailored to their needs? Because it's a chicken and egg. I mean, just because you have an ESG report doesn't mean that it's any use. So I think that's kind of where I think the underwriting challenges are. Is it's not just a case of getting the information, it's figuring out what the business process is and what you do with that piece of information. And also, if you get a scoring system, so you get a piece of information that says this insured is 6 out of 10 on ESG. What does that mean? And is that good or bad? And what does that mean for the premium? And if you have another similar organization that's 4 out of 10, do you charge them more premium, or do you walk away? What does it all mean? I think we don't really know at the moment. We're not sophisticated enough. And so I think that's one piece of it, is how do you use it to select who you want to insure. The other piece is how can you enhance your product to be more ESG relevant.
And beyond making sure that we get the right ESG information, is there now kind of less reliance we can place on our historical data? Do we need to question it and interrogate it more? Disregard it?
I think it depends if you mean specifically cat risk data, in terms of the property market. I think there's pretty strong evidence that the last 5 years of hurricane activity is different to the last 25 years of hurricane activity. And that's probably the key peril for a lot of insurers. I mean, if you're a UK domestic insurer, that's not the key peril. The key peril is flood, and that has changed. So it kind of depends on where you are, what your target market are. You know, there's been quite a lot more hail activity, and unfortunately, there's hail events in places that have subsidized the fitting of solar panels, which does lead to a lot of damage, unfortunately, for a clean technology. So I think it's the whole climate change package. You've got windstorm, you've got flood, you've got hail, you've got wildfire. There's probably more, but those are the main ones I can think of. And the past is not a good predictor of the future. You know, we've seen that wildfire frequency's gone up, but also it's occurring in US and Canadian states and territories that it didn't happen in before. So, you know, the exposure is moving. So I think that I think what it's going to force people to do is to either invest in continuing to better understand these issues or decide to outside their appetite and to get out. Certainly for Argo, wildfire is not something we're comfortable with, and we're just making sure we're not exposed to those zip codes.
And you've certainly talked a lot about what companies need to be prioritizing and putting in place, but what kind of level of resource do you think companies need to be investing as far as money and time, and perhaps, you know, hiring a ESG specialist or a team that's fully focused on ESG?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I'm seeing a lot of companies grappling with that one. We have a decentralized model, so you know I basically have one person works for me on ESG, and then everybody else is we're leveraging the expertise on D&I or information security or training that's already there. But what it means is there's a big coordination exercise, and also there's a fair amount of communication and selling to get people to want to help. The answer to the question is really back to the context and the strategy. So how, you know, if you are a private company, then you haven't got shareholders, you haven't got those kind of pressures, you've got less reporting expectations, then you might find that it's your customers that are pushing you, saying, well, we don't want to buy insurance from an organization that isn't, you know, ESG friendly. So that would suggest that you need to come up with solutions that are tailored to that. So what you do is really dependent on either having a very proactive board level strategy that says we want to be positioned in this spot in the market, or your stakeholders kind of pushing you in a certain direction. So I think there's not necessarily a need to have a huge amount of resource, but it's probably more important to be absolutely clear on what you're trying to achieve. The danger with hiring ESG people without that clarity is there's going to be a lot of effort put into reporting and disclosure, because that's the visible thing. But if there isn't a kind of commitment to change, then you're not going to have much to report.
This is, you know, perhaps a little contentious, and we don't have to talk so specifically about it, but if we look at, you know, what's going on in Russia these days, how does that, or kind of similar world events, how should that be factoring into a company's ESG strategy?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, but I think I did touch on the social side. I haven't really talked about the social side impacting underwriting, but if you think about um, maybe a slightly more straightforward example, so cotton that comes from China is quite contentious. So is that something that you want to be involved in that supply chain? Would you want, if you're doing cargo insurance, do you want to be insuring that kind of cargo? What happens if you are insuring cargo that has been produced from modern slavery or child labor? So it's in a way it's really a question of what questions you ask and what you do with the answers. And from a Russia-Ukraine point of view, the insurance of Russian entities is only really the tip of the iceberg, because there's all the multinationals that are operating in Russia with assets and operations in Russia, and there's all the supply chains that go in and out of Russia. So it starts to get quite complicated and difficult to draw the line. What's the difference between an organization that has a turnover 100 million and is 100% Russian, and an organization that's a billion and 10% of its operations in Russia? I don't know. They are they're not black and white answers, and I think the purpose of ESG is to help to draw the lines, which are basically, because I'm a risk person, they're risk appetite lines, but they're not really about quantification. They're about moral judgments, which is uncomfortable when you're dealing with insurance, but it's no different to dealing with sanctioned countries. Just because a country is or isn't sanctioned at any point in time, even if there are no sanctions, you may not feel comfortable as an organization doing business with them. And it's no different to taking a stance on insuring tobacco or weapons.
What do you think is the biggest failure of companies in their ESG strategies these days?
Well, I kind of gave you the hint at the beginning, starting with the reporting and kind of having that, oh my God, I've got to report something, I better go and do something to report, but not having a joined up strategy or really a plan. And I think the biggest challenge that we've got is partly the regulation, because there's going to be demand for data from insurance regulators, but also stock exchange type regulators. And my fear is that there's going to be so much focus on disclosure and reporting, and there's going to be oversight from external bodies, be it consultants or external auditors, that leads to the focus being on the numbers that are disclosed and nothing else gets done. So just to give you a really simple example, if we were to disclose our greenhouse gas emissions and we said, oh well, it's 100, doesn't matter what the units are, it's 100, and then we go through 3 months of work and an auditor says, no, it's not, it's 102.3, and we've wasted all that time, and when we should have been saying, well, it's 100, and how are we going to get to 60, which is actually what this is all about. So that's my concern, is that, and well, you say, well, why would people do that? Well, it's because of what I mentioned, which is greenwashing. People are worried that organizations are saying what they think their stakeholders want to hear rather than what they've actually done. And so there's a breakdown in trust. And so people, and particularly the investment community, are saying, well, this company's put out its greenhouse gas emissions, but how do I know that's real? I want it verified. So that creates a kind of secondary industry. And I think that's the challenge we're all going to face.
That's the end of the questions I've seen come in. So I think we can get this to a nice 45 minutes. If there's any last minute questions anyone wants to send right now or any last comments you want to provide.
No, well, I'm glad to speak to you all. You're all blank screens with initials. So hello, everybody, and I hope that was useful. And if there are any other questions afterwards, I'm sure Natalie can send an email on to me.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending. And as I said, there's going to be plenty more CPCU events for the chapter this year. So make sure your membership's up to date, renew if you need to, and get in touch if you need to. Thank you all for coming and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.